Hello and welcome to Africa Live. I'm Famida Miller. Tonight we roll out a special edition revisiting the key news events of 2014 and looking ahead to what 2015 holds for the continent and its place globally. We have lots of news and analysis lined up, including the resilient continent, how Africa faced up to challenges including Ebola and terrorism through 2014. Getting governance right, more than 20 African countries successfully held elections this year. And still rising, a pulse check on Africa's growing economies. But first, we begin with news making headlines today. We begin in Cameroon, where it's killed several Boko Haram insurgents in airstrikes. It's the first time Cameroon has deployed fighter jets to engage the insurgents after they reportedly overran and took control of a military base in the north of the country. CCTV's Deji Badmus has more.
The Cameroon military says about 1,000 Boko Haram insurgents stormed the military base in the remote northern town of Achigachia on Sunday. Military spokesman Didier Bajek said troops in the base then retreated before President Paul Biya ordered airstrikes, forcing the insurgents to abandon the base. There's been no official confirmation of any casualty figure, but reports say the insurgents killed about 30 civilians in separate attacks on 5 other villages. About 100 insurgents were reportedly killed in the airstrikes. Now, Boko Haram has often carried out cross-border raids in the remote northern town of Cameroon, but this is the first time the sect would attempt to seize a military facility there. Cameroon has stepped up its offensive against the sect, and authorities there say the airstrikes is, quote, a new escalation in the Cameroonian response to multiple enemy attacks by the Boko Haram terrorist group, end of quote. Deji Badmus, CCTV, Lagos, Nigeria.
Let's now take a quick look at other stories making headlines on the continent. Forces loyal to Libya's internationally recognized government have staged airstrikes on targets in Misrata, allied to an armed group that seized the capital earlier this year. That's according to officials and residents. The North African country, a major oil producer, has been engulfed in fighting between the two sides, each with its own government and parliament. Prime Minister Abdullah Al-Tini has been forced to run a rump state in the east since a group known as Libya Dawn took control of Tripoli in August, setting up a rival government and parliament. Somalia's militant group Al-Shabaab's played down the surrender and arrest of a senior militant figure. The group says the official had left the movement more than a year ago, referring to Zakaria Ismail Ahmed Hersi, identified as a top Al-Shabaab intelligence official, saying he's of little value. Hersi, who handed himself over to authorities, had a $3 million bounty on his head. The group says news of the defection was only released in order to shift attention away from last week's Al-Shabaab attack against the headquarters of the African Union Force in the capital, Mogadishu. And hopes are fading for the release of Australian journalist Peter Greste, who's been in jail in Egypt for a year now after Cairo sent mixed signals about his case. Hopes had been raised last week about the possibility that Greste could be freed before an appeal hearing set for January 1st. President Sisi has suggested in November he was considering pardoning Greste and 2 other journalists working for Qatar-based Al Jazeera. But Australia's foreign minister says Egyptian counterpart had informed him that they would have to await the appeal. Now, let's begin our review of the year with what's arguably Africa's biggest challenge 2014, the Ebola outbreak. The outbreak in West Africa was first reported in March and rapidly became the deadliest occurrence of the disease since its discovery in 1976. In fact, the current epidemic has now killed more than all other known Ebola outbreaks combined. At the end of last week, there were 19,497 reported cases of Ebola, with 7,588 reported deaths. Reported case incidents are fluctuating in Guinea and decreasing in Liberia, There are signs that the increase in incidents has slowed in Sierra Leone, although the country's west is now experiencing the most intense transmission in the affected countries. Nigeria, Senegal, as well as Mali, which had reported cases, have successfully contained the virus. A different strain of the virus had also broken out in DR Congo. It was also successfully contained. Now, it did take the world some time to react. By the time the international community was responding, Ebola had moved from an epidemic to a catastrophe. CCTV's Robert Nagila tells us more.
In December 2013, a 2-year-old boy in the remote Guinean village of Milindo began suffering fever, headache and diarrhea. Emile Omonu died days later, followed by his 3-year-old sister and pregnant mother. It was the start of the Ebola outbreak that would claim more than 6,000 lives within a year, stretching from West Africa, Europe and the United States. But initially, the global community was slow to act, leaving it to aid charities.
I am declaring the current outbreak of Ebola virus disease a public health emergency of international concern.
Less than 3 months later, the World Health Organization confirmed Liberia's first case.
Our partners and ourselves were a little bit slow in this because we didn't understand this disease.
2 months later, Sierra Leone reported its first case. A pregnant woman who'd traveled from Guinea.
Our family is really dying.
Now we don't get help. What's our problem?
From here, Ebola accelerated its spread, with health workers paying a high price. Confirmed infections in Nigeria, Mali and Senegal were quickly contained.
We will not have defeated this disease until we have defeated it where it is most prevalent, and that is in West Africa.
China, the US, Britain and France led the way with aid for affected countries. China dispatched over 100 medical and laboratory teams and contributed more than $40 million in aid.
The Chinese government will continue to provide aid within its resources based on the development of the epidemic and the emergency needs of the related countries.
Cuba also sent a team of health workers. In Africa, Kenya contributed $1 million and was part of an African effort including Nigeria, Uganda, Rwanda to send in health workers.
Africa is working together with the international community to stem out the epidemic. And please, fight the virus, fight the disease, don't fight Africans.
Liberia and Guinea have seen the rate of infections decrease dramatically. But in Sierra Leone, the disease shows no signs of abating. The government has banned Christmas celebrations in an effort to control the spread. Robert Nagila, CCTV, Nairobi.
Now, for more on this, we're joined by Dr. Margaret Harris, the spokesperson for Ebola at the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva. Welcome to Africa Live. Now, Dr. Harris, what would you consider the key successes in the battle against Ebola so far?
The key successes has been the incredible engagement of not only the international community, but the local communities who did not know what was going on and were terrified of this disease. And yet they managed to eventually rally and come round and understand what needed to be done. And in the parts of the countries where those communities have really been engaged, we have actually got down to 0 cases. I'm talking about places like Lofa County in Liberia and also Kailahun, which was the first place to be infected in Sierra Leone, and they haven't seen a case for more than a month now, 32 days without a case. And that is really down to communities being very involved, very vigilant, getting people to treatment early, and making sure that everybody is buried safely.
Now, at this point, we see cases fluctuating, some decreasing, and we are heading to about 20,000 reported cases as we approach the end of the year. What still needs to be done?
A great deal still needs to be done. From the lessons we've learned, we've seen that we need to make sure we reach absolutely every district. We need to reach every district with very well trained healthcare workers. We need to train people and provide people in communities, so that's good community workers. As I said before, we need to engage very much with the communities. We need large numbers of burial teams able to bury safely, and we need communities to understand that a safe and dignified burial is absolutely necessary for everyone who may have died of Ebola. It's difficult because people have really important traditional and cultural practices, but it's essential because this is not a disease we can allow to go on. We have to get down to 0 cases in 2015.
Now, Dr. Harris, looking at some of the challenges that still exist, how do you expect that you'd reach that 0 number in 2015? What is the forecast realistically heading to the new year?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear what you said, but to get down to 0 cases, as I said, we're going to need a tremendous amount of work. Everybody in those 3 countries is going to have to still focus on making sure that they follow very safe hygiene practices, that they are aware of the symptoms of Ebola, and the minute somebody has any of those symptoms, get to treatment early. We have seen that if people get to treatment early, their survival rates increase dramatically. So it's not just a matter of preventing the spread, it is a matter of really having a chance to survive this disease. So get to treatment as early as possible. The other things we know are in the pipeline are vaccines. We're going to move into phase 2 of the research into vaccines to see if these vaccines are effective, and that will be happening in some of the countries nearby. And soon after that, we will move to trying the vaccines in the affected countries. So a lot of things are going to happen in 2015, but the most important thing is that we work together very, very hard to eliminate this disease.
Just lastly, Dr. Harris, before we let you go, what is the expectation with regard to the release of those vaccines, of course, depending on the outcome in the trials?
Well, as soon as we've got the scientific data that proves that they're not only safe, they're also effective, there is going to be a tremendous amount of work to scale up the production of the vaccine and work out how to get them to everybody who needs to have a vaccine in the affected countries. Now, we don't anticipate that we will be able to reach that level of coverage until the middle of next year, but given the work that I've seen, the incredible work the scientific community is putting in, the regulators, the people developing the vaccines, they're getting together, they're on the phone, they're working together all the time. Given the speed with which this has happened, we might even see it earlier.
All right, Dr. Harris, thanks very much for your time this evening. We're speaking there to Dr. Margaret Harris from the World Health Organization. It's time now for a quick break. When we come back, securing Africa, how the continent dealt with the threat of terrorism. Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live. Now, 2014 was also a year of several security challenges for the continent. Some of the most dramatic headlines were about Nigerian rebels Boko Haram. Their attacks are thought to have killed more than 2,000 people this year alone. The Islamist group also seized control over much of northeastern Nigeria, but one incident thrust Boko Haram onto the global stage. CCTV's Deji Badmus has more.
A fifth year of insurgency, and the bloodshed is getting worse. The government has now claimed at least 3 times to have killed Boko Haram leader Abubakar Shekau. Just recently, it claimed to have secured a ceasefire too. Boko Haram's response? Almost daily attacks and several occasionally gruesome videos. This video though really caught the world's attention. More than 200 schoolgirls kidnapped from their school in Chibok in April. The news sparked global outrage and international assistance in the hunt, a collaboration that at one stage brought together the likes of China, America and Israel. So far, to no avail. 8 months on, Boko Haram says the girls have been converted and married off. Many Nigerians are losing hope they'll ever come home.
Honestly, I also feel disappointed because terrorists that have been holding these girls hostage, the way terrorists are going about, it shows that they are confident that these girls will still be kept.
The government insists they can still be recovered, but not by force.
It is better if we get these girls under whatever circumstances. If they have any problem, we can resolve it. If they have any psychological issue, we can employ experts to help us. If they have issue of deprivation, we can assist. We can give support to their mother. But we don't want to bring body bags.
Some survivors say the best plan to combat Boko Haram is to arm vigilantes.
Permit me to say they are more brave in fighting these people or standing them than the military. That is the truth. Okay, one may not want to hear this, but that is the truth. So the solution is let the government empower the vigilante. Let them allow the vigilante, okay, to go in. All right, they know the terrain. Partly maybe they know the terrain. Number 2 is that look, these people, okay, look, they are fighting for their life now.
The government says its troops are turning the tide, but just this month alone, 54 soldiers were sentenced to death for refusing to fight Boko Haram. Residents claim the army frequently flees alongside civilians whenever Boko Haram strikes. Deji Badmus, CCTV, Lagos, Nigeria.
Now, joining us in studio is CCTV's Robert Nagila with more details on the story. Robert, you've traveled to Nigeria a number of times and also to areas affected by the Boko Haram insurgency. Why have they proved so difficult to defeat?
Thank you, Famida. Well, the problem with Nigeria's military is two-pronged. The first one is the approach, the tactics they're using at this particular moment. They're not fighting a conventional force, yet those are the tactics they keep employing against Boko Haram. Boko Haram does not respect the Geneva Convention, so that has to change. Number 2 is the morale of the forces themselves. We've seen several soldiers brought up before court-martial for deserting the army because the morale is down. They do not want to fight Boko Haram. Some claim it's because of inadequate weaponry, while others say simply that some of them actually have alliances with Boko Haram. So those are the 2 things that need to be sorted out immediately, but most importantly, intelligence.
All right, Robert, I'm going to ask you to stay with us just a while longer because apart from the Boko Haram threat, 2014 has been a difficult year for the continent in terms of terrorism. Attacks have been on the increase in East and North Africa. Experts say several factors contributed to the radicalization of the continent. Jane Kyo has this report.
The 2nd of December, northeastern Kenya, the town of Mandera. And here, the bodies of 36 non-Muslim miners slain by Somali insurgent group Al-Shabaab. They were killed as they slept in their tents at a stone quarry. Some were shot, others decapitated. Just 10 days before, in the same region, non-Muslims were dragged off a Nairobi-bound bus. 28 of them were shot and killed at point-blank range. The 2 attacks highlighted not only the fact that Al-Shabaab still has a reach throughout the region, but also that the threat of this militant group is not just Somalia's problem. Kenya sent its army into Somalia in 2011 to protect its territory. Ugandan, Ethiopian and Burundian forces are also fighting the militant group in Somalia. And although Kenya has become Al-Shabaab's most successful target, Nairobi refuses to back down.
We will not flinch or relent in the war against terrorism in our country and our region. We shall continue to inflict painful casualties on these terrorists until we secure our country and region. Our stability and prosperity depends on a secure neighborhood, and this is our commitment.
And as East Africa grapples with Al-Shabaab, North Africa too is facing militants. Aside from Al-Qaeda's North African wing, the crisis in Libya has brought the Islamic State militancy much closer to Africa. There have been reports of emerging training camps in the country for ISIL-affiliated groups. Tunisian and Egyptian Islamist groups have also recently declared their loyalty to ISIL.
We've known for a number of years that whatever impact these groups are having, it's largely globally inspired, but locally conducted, locally resourced, locally commanded.
The Islamic State militants are fighting local and international forces in Syria and Iraq. They control large parts of both countries. And despite their brutal methods, they are considered by some radical groups as more successful than Al-Qaeda has ever been. At the same time, thousands of disaffected North African young people have traveled to Syria and Iraq to fight for ISIL.
I think that the flow of foreign fighters is particularly notable in regard to ISIL, so that underscores the importance there of watching these people, trying to stop them from moving, figuring out when they're coming back, figuring out what tactics they're bringing back with them.
The threat to the North African region became even more apparent when an Algerian jihadist group linked to ISIL beheaded tourist Half Godel. Well, overall, 2014 has seen some success stories against terrorist groups too. But increasingly, these groups have cast wider nets and gained networks of powerful allies. But even as they become more powerful and deadly, one thing has been highlighted, that African countries can no longer afford to stand alone when taking on terrorist groups. And it's crucial that governments unite against this common threat. Jane Keo, CCTV, Nairobi, Kenya.
Now, Robert, radicalization, militancy, terrorism, these aren't problems that plague Africa alone. They are a global problem. But how do we expect to see it impact Africa specifically in the coming year?
Well, Femida, I actually believe that terrorism will once again be the biggest story in 2015. It was the biggest story in 2014 up until we had Ebola come up. Now, you've got North Africa at the moment, you've got West Africa, Eastern Africa, all grappling with the threat of terror. Now, whichever way it goes, whether it gets worse or they solve the problem, it will still be a very big story. And it all gets down to, number one, cooperation between the governments and the public. Number two, intelligence, which has been really lacking, not just in West Africa, in Eastern Africa as well. Northern Africa is a bigger mess. But apart from that, we still have several other conflicts which are ongoing, which could then deteriorate into terror. We're talking about Central African Republic. We're talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo. And if unchecked, the situations in those countries will become, if not as bad, even worse than what the rest of the regions are experiencing at this particular moment.
Certainly concerning developments heading to the new year. Robert, thanks very much. Robert Nagila there. Well, it's time now for a quick break. When we come back. Cracking the governance puzzle, Africa's journey in democracy. Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live. Now, in 2014, CCTV Africa's covered elections in Egypt, South Africa, Mozambique, Tunisia, as well as Namibia. And they all have something in common. They were well organized, declared free and fair, and their results generally accepted. Jane Kyo finds out if African democracy is moving to the next level.
Dr. Hage Gottfried Geinkop, who has accumulated a total of 772,528 votes in the presidential race.
An overwhelming victory for Namibia's ruling SWAPO party. Hage Geinkop won presidential elections with a landslide 87%. The victory came as no surprise though, since SWAPO has been in power for decades. But this vote was significant. It was Africa's first ever e-election. With its small population, Namibia succeeded in electronic voting, where the likes of Kenya failed.
I'll be a president for all the Namibian people. I have been saying, no Namibian must feel left out.
Geinkop wasn't the only African leader to make that same promise.
Those who are not with the people are not going to vote for them. And that's what has happened.
Over in South Africa, Jacob Zuma has faced a series of challenges this year.
All the people of South Africa who voted for the ANC.
But history and the ruling ANC were both on his side. And elections went smoothly in countries like Mozambique, Botswana, and Egypt too. Well, all those votes had their accusations of rigging and irregularities, but they were declared mostly free, fair and transparent. So the question is whether Africa is becoming more democratic. Well, some say it is. Others say the continent still has a long way to go.
Let's take the Egyptian election. A man who was a military man transforms himself and now says he's no longer a military person and proceeds to go to an election and is elected as a civilian. Certainly that man is not a civilian. He is a military man. Only that the dynamics and the mechanics of organizing an election in Africa take consensus, take a certain form of agreement which people tend to agree at the end of it, but is not necessarily democratic. So it's safe to argue that in Africa, elections do not necessarily amount to democracy.
So firstly, a leadership issue. Analysts have in the past accused leaders of not showing enough commitment to their people. Added to that is the continent's cultural diversity. Often considered a positive thing, it can, unfortunately, also lead to tension. What we do know is that democracy is evolving in Africa.
So we need a democracy that blends African values and African virtues together with some modern values and so on. Now that is an easier statement to say, but sometimes what we do is that when we embrace democracy, we want to embrace it 100%. When we also want to degenerate to our side, we want to degenerate at 100%. But what we need is a mix of this and something that works. If it works for Rwanda the way they are, let it work for them. If it works for Kenya the way we are, let it work for us. But we cannot have a one dress fit all, or one size fit all.
And the evolution of African democracy looks to include the end of strongmen. Experts warn that clinging to power for decades may no longer be an option. It started in 2011 with Tunisia, Egypt and later Libya. Senegal followed too. And this year it was Burkina Faso's Blaise Compaoré who was ousted. That could point to an imagined maturity in leadership trend on the continent.
The threat of degeneration is real. And so African leaders have tended now to want to agree and move on rather than to disagree and ban their countries.
Clearly, several factors are changing the way Africans think about their leaders and their actions. And the continent can look forward to several key tests of democracy in 2015. One of the biggest come in February, when Africa's top economy, Nigeria, goes to the polls. And it's likely voters will be looking towards who will provide the most security. Jane Keo, CCTV.
Now, while various African countries were seeking the dividends of successful democratic successions, most of the countries in North Africa affected by the wave of Arab unrest were still struggling to find their footing through 2014. Some, like Tunisia, appear to have turned the corner and may be in the process of conducting a peaceful transition after successful elections. Others, like Libya, however, appear to have spiraled from bad to worse as political factions and militias battle for control. Egypt, one of the major powers in the region, is also seeking to turn the corner from a tumultuous post-revolution transition. Adil Maruhi has more.
2014 began with the transition from Islamist President Mohamed Morsi to a newly elected authority. On January 24th, militants bombed the Interior Ministry's Cairo headquarters. The blast was so massive that it created a 50-meter wave from its epicenter. Another memorable attack was on June 30th, when President El-Sisi supporters were planning to commemorate the ouster of Morsi from power.
Last year, people were afraid to go out, so whatever is happening now is better. There's plenty of security. Police troops are everywhere today. When I go home, I stop in plenty of checkpoints, so they're watching out for further attacks.
The country has escalated its fight against terrorism, covering land, sea and air. Militants have destroyed at least 1 army helicopters in Sinai and sacked 1 ship in the Mediterranean and dozens of armored trucks and military transportation buses. On the other hand, the government alleged it had killed scores of militants and neutralized dozens of cells and bomb factories. Many Egyptians feel the country is becoming secure.
The government is overdoing its job in security. It needs the people to help out. People must stop protesting and concentrating on their jobs.
Security forces are now protecting vital areas, but I think the media is exaggerating the power of terrorism. There are plenty of reports on bombs being diffused.
The number of attacks decreased in the second half of 2014. But 2 were the deadliest. One in the western city of Al-Farafra, the other was in El-Sheikh Zuwayed, a stronghold of militants in the Sinai east of Egypt. Over 50 army troops killed and at least 25 injured in both attacks. Almost all attacks in Egypt targeted police and army troops. Egypt might be getting safer than when it was earlier in 2014, but the war is not over. Some militant groups have sworn allegiance to the Islamic State, vowing to continue their attacks on the country. And the government announced an escalation in its crackdown against militants and their supporting Islamists, marking them all as terrorists. Adil Mahroui, CCTV, Cairo.
Now, to discuss this further, we're joined live from Cairo by Dr. Jihad Auda, a political science professor at Helwan University. Welcome to Africa Live. Now, there has been a change of guard in Egypt, but some argue that the military still appears to wield a lot of influence in the country's affairs. What can we anticipate in the coming year?
Let me explain something at the very beginning. That is, I don't think the military took over anything. There was a crisis in authority crisis, a great authority crisis, which galvanized major demonstrations and major uprisings in the country, which really toppled the regime of Mohamed Morsi. So Mohamed Morsi vanished or disappeared as a result of a deep crisis, because he was not able to handle the authority, how to manage authority. That's number one. Number two, as at the military, you have to understand something about the military in Egypt. The military in Egypt Egypt is the creation of the military, since 1805 or something like that. And since that, the military is a very major component in the political and social life. Now, because of the changes in the political system of the world, and because of the world political changes, we would like very much, or we started to civilianize But knowing that the civilian part, the civilian forces were not able to withhold any major component of power, was not able to assume any component of power, was not able to really so the military was alone. If we need the country to move along, to move all forward, we have to have a cooperation between military forces and civilian forces. But until now, the forthcoming, the civilians are not forthcoming. The civilian forces are not organized, are highly disorganized, and we don't have any civilian forces or any civilian persona that able to assemble people together, or any civilian party able to assume great role, or rather to create an image for the future.
Dr. Ada, we'll have to leave it there for the moment. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We're speaking there to Dr. Jihad Aude, a political science professor at Helwan University. It's time now for another quick break. When we come back, strengthening ties, China-Africa relations in 2014. Welcome back. China's new administration has shown strong engagement with Africa since its inauguration in March 2013. Soon after taking office, President Xi Jinping made an unprecedented visit to Africa. His visit was soon followed by that of the Premier Li Keqiang in 2014, which focused heavily on expanding economic ties with the continent. Susan Wangeli takes a look at the Premier's visit.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang began the first leg of his four-nation tour in Ethiopia. The two countries signed a raft of agreements which included loans and cooperation agreements for the construction of roads and industrial zones. Li also met the African Union chairperson Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma and commissioners at the headquarters of the African Union Commission. There he delivered his China-Africa policy speech, where he said Africa remained China's biggest priority and that Beijing would further work with the continent on poverty eradication and strengthen its ties with the continent.
This time, China and the AU have issued the program for strengthening China-Africa cooperation on poverty reduction. We are ready to share with African countries our experience in poverty reduction.
Premier Li also underlined 6 primary areas of cooperation, namely industry, finance, poverty reduction, ecological protection, people-to-people exchanges, and peace and security. To reach this level of cooperation, Premier Li said China and Africa should enhance the Cooperation Forum as an important platform. After his tour of Ethiopia, the Premier headed to Nigeria. Li hailed the close ties between Nigeria and China, saying Nigeria is China's important partner as it is the largest economy in Africa. A highlight of his trip was his appearance at the World Economic Forum in Abuja.
We should make good use of the golden key of innovation and promote innovations in institutions, technology and science. By doing so, we will be able to maintain a medium to high growth rate and upgrade the Chinese economy as well.
Li also visited Angola and Kenya, where he signed a series of bilateral agreements. It is hoped that, with his 2014 visit, An upgraded version of China-Africa all-round cooperation will be created to further carry forward the relationship to a new era. Susan Mungeli, CCTV.
The year witnessed a significant expansion of China's activities in Africa, from mediation in South Sudan to the deployment of more peacekeepers and the frontline role in the fight against Ebola. Kofam Renje has more.
The signs of China's growing engagement with Africa were there early in 2013, when President Xi Jinping made Tanzania, South Africa and Congo among the first places he visited after taking office. Then another visit to Ethiopia, Nigeria, Angola and Kenya.
Welcome to Kenya. It's a pleasure to have you here.
By China's Premier Li Keqiang in May 2014. And this year, the relationship has grown stronger. China's growing role in Africa has even led to a public change in Beijing's foreign policy. Previously, China has avoided getting involved in the internal affairs of other countries. The conflict in South Sudan has changed that.
But this time, as all these situations change and China being requested again and again by IGAD country, AU, and even South Sudan government, we should be more active than before to be involved in mediation. So I think our leaders took the decision that we should do something more.
China has played a key role in pushing for peace in South Sudan. The country's special envoy on African affairs has been on the front line, and Beijing plans to deploy more than 700 combat troops into South Sudan by March next year. They will form part of the UN peacekeeping force.
We are new here. We are new in this field, in this peace and security situation. We need to learn a lot. First, of course, from our African friends. Second, also from other countries who involved in African continent for so many years.
China has got some significant investments in South Sudan, and they've been threatened by the ongoing conflict. But analysts say this new approach by China could mean more engagement with Africa in the future.
China is a major power, and there are expectations that the major powers will behave responsibly in taking up the responsibility of peace and security where appropriate.
Then came Ebola, the deadly virus that has killed thousands in West Africa. And China was on the front line again, sending medical teams and medical supplies in Liberia, Sierra Leone and Guinea to help contain the situation. It's dramatic evidence of China's willingness to help Africa in whatever challenges the continent faces. Kofam Renje, CCTV, Nairobi, Kenya.
Right now with that, let's join Rama for a review of business through 2014.
Indeed, Famida. Now, 2014, of course, was a year of highs and lows in the business world. These are the top 3 stories that had our attention, and hopefully yours as well, over the last 52 weeks. Now, while the Ebola outbreak in general was concentrated in just 3 countries in Africa, the ripple effects were felt right across the entire African continent. By the 24th of December, 7,500 people had died. There were over 19,000 more infected as well. Now, earlier in the year, in October, the World Bank had forecast that the cost of this outbreak could be as high as $32 billion. Later on, however, they revised that number a lot lower in November, down to anywhere between 3 to 4 billion US dollars in total. So what does this story mean for us in 2015? We'll be looking at 2 key things: efforts to restore food security in the affected states, Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone, and also be looking at the damage done to the tourism sectors in other Ebola-free countries. There's a ripple effect in terms of perception that, of course, has whipsawed right across the continent this year. Now, sovereign bonds. This was also another big story for us this year. Before 2006, only South Africa had issued any Eurobond at all. This year, over $7 billion worth of sovereign bonds hit the market from sub-Saharan issuers as a whole. The thing is, though, as the dollar keeps rising in 2015 and with the Fed poised to raise rates, you have to wonder, will the markets be as favorable to sub-Saharan African issuers in 2015 as they have been this year? One more story that we're keeping a very close eye on. It was a fairly big one, especially in the second half of the year. The oil price crash. The decline in oil prices since June has been a bit of a mixed bag, depending on which side of the fence you're on. All factors being constant, net oil importers are set for a mini stimulus of sorts, and low inflation, of course, will certainly be a good benefit. On the other hand, oil-dependent economies like Nigeria, Angola, Ghana, they're in for a world of hurt, and that number certainly doesn't inspire any confidence at all. But we will certainly be looking at the risks involved for all these countries a little later on in the next hour. Now, speaking of Nigeria, in early 2014, it vaulted past South Africa to become the biggest economy on the continent after the conclusion of a long overdue rebasing exercise. Despite its GDP now being $510 billion, don't let that number fool you. Nigeria still faces an enormous variety of challenges, as Deji Badmus reports.
When Nigeria announced it was finally rebasing its GDP, economists in the country felt it was long overdue, coming some 13 years after the last one was done. Analysts had predicted the new rebased figure was going to make Nigeria the largest economy in Africa, but no one could tell for sure what the exact figure would be. When Nigeria's Statistician General eventually released the rebased GDP figure, it was $510 billion, surpassing expectations, but sparking fears the huge size of the economy could stagnate growth in a country that had consistently averaged a growth rate of 6.5%.
The bigger the economy in the real sense of it, the more difficult it is to move at a very high speed. We should in fact, as policymakers, should look very closely at China, because China is one big economy that has been able to perform, let me call it that miracle, of growing fast in spite of the size. So that really is the greatest challenge in the outcome of this rebasing.
If there's one thing the new GDP figure has done for Nigeria, it has forced investors that would have otherwise ignored the country to have a rethink. And despite the country's security challenges, the government says investments are pouring in.
We've had companies like Lafarge, for example, investing more than $100 billion in Gombe, for example. We have firms like companies, investors like Dangote, investing heavily in sugarcane to sugar in most of the northern states, in Taraba, in Adamawa, in all those, at least 5 of those northern states.
In spite of the investments in new GDP, Nigeria still has one of the highest unemployment rates on the continent. The scale of the problem was clearly demonstrated when in March this year, 6.5 million job seekers turned out for a recruitment test for just 400 vacancies in the Nigerian Immigration Service. About 16 persons died following a stampede during the exercise.
If investors will come into Nigeria, we should begin to look very closely at the number of jobs the investments we create, and not just in the quantum of investment, and not just in the fact that, yes, they brought in money. So we celebrate Nigeria as attracting the largest volume of foreign direct investment in Africa, which of course we have attained since 2009. So we have to look beyond that and begin to look at how these investments will begin to create jobs.
For ordinary Nigerians, it is difficult to understand how their country could be rated the biggest economy on the continent and still fail to provide them with jobs. It's a contradiction they are struggling to come to terms with, and the harder they try to understand it, the more confusing they get. More than anything else, the job crisis here remains the biggest challenge confronting the government. Deji Badmus, CCTV, Lagos, Nigeria.
Now we'll be back with an in-depth review of the top business stories from across Africa in 2014 in the next hour. We'll be covering everything from the economic damage from the Ebola outbreak to how low oil prices are a double-edged sword for countries like Egypt, and much more with an investment analyst, George Bodo from Ecobank. Back to you, Famida.
Thanks very much, Rama. While we do continue with our review for just a short while longer, including Africa's most followed trial, the Oscar Pistorius saga.
My dream is to get every young kid in a township to follow their dream, to meet their talent, to realize their potential. And my dream for Africa is to make arts, culture and entertainment a viable, self-supporting vocation for anyone who chooses to do that.
And one advice I want to give to African youth is they have to be together. They have to fight for their rights and for what they want. They have to contribute to our continent development.
You're watching Africa Live. Now, 2014 will be long remembered for events at the North Gauteng High Court in South Africa. The Oscar Pistorius murder trial captivated audiences around the globe. The proceedings were tense, dramatic, as well as heartbreaking. Dan Williams now brings us the story of the still unfolding Pistorius saga.
It was dubbed the trial of the decade. And remarkably, the Oscar Pistorius court case would be televised, allowing millions around the world a grandstand seat for the proceedings. The athlete's arrival each day was often a chaotic scrum. The question before the court was not who did it, but why. The prosecution argued it was murder. But Pistorius claimed he mistook his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp for an intruder when he shot 4 bullets at his bathroom door.
Do you understand the charges, Mr. Pistorius?
I do, my lady.
How do you plead?
Not guilty, my lady.
The witnesses provided traumatic testimony.
When I'm in the shower, I relive her shouts.
You said to him that when you're in the shower, you relive the shouts.
Her terrifying screams.
Riva's mother, June, was there to witness events for herself. Pistorius wept and vomited in the courthouse. On day 18, a pivotal moment. Pistorius took the stand and he began with an apology to Riva's family.
I can't imagine the pain and the sorrow and the emptiness that I've caused you and your family. I was simply trying to protect Riva. I can promise that when she went to bed that night, she felt loved.
But in cross-examination, prosecutor Gerry Nel, known as the Bull Terrier, painted a very different scenario.
Have a look there, mister. I know you don't want to because you don't want to take responsibility, but it's time that you look at it. Take responsibility for what you've done, Mr. Pistorius.
My lady, I've taken responsibility by me waiting and not wanting to live my life, but waiting for my time on this stand to tell my story for the respect of Riva. And for myself, I've taken responsibility, but I will not look at a picture where I'm tormented by what I saw and felt that night. As I picked Riva up, my fingers touched her head. I remember. I don't have to look at a picture. I was there.
Nel ripped holes in Pistorius' version of events.
Mr. Pistorius, I don't know what you're answering. My question was, are you thinking of the implications of the answer? Yes or no? That was the answer and you'd give me this version.
My lady, if I was sitting here and I wouldn't think of every implication of what I say, it would be reckless. My life is on the line. Of course I think of every single word I say when I'm sitting here.
But Riva doesn't have a life anymore because of what you've done.
Nel argued that Pistorius, at the very least, should be convicted of murder.
My lady, he knew there was a human being in the toilet. That's his evidence. He can't get away from that. His intention was to kill a human being.
But the one person who mattered was Judge Masipa, and she decided it was culpable homicide.
The sentence imposed is a maximum imprisonment of 5 years.
Pistorius was led away to Pretoria Central Prison. Although he had been handed a 5-year sentence, he knew then that he would likely serve 10 months in jail. But this story would have a twist in the tale. The prosecution successfully appealed the ruling, and it means that the Supreme Court of Appeal will now decide whether Pistorius should have been found guilty of murder. Pistorius is being held in this prison in Pretoria. He could be released in August, but he now faces the possibility of a potential 15-year sentence. Dan Williams, CCTV, Pretoria, South Africa.
Well, that's how we wrap up this edition of Africa Live and the Year in Review. Remember, you can send your feedback to africalive@cctv.com, and you can also stay in touch with us on Twitter using the handle CCTV News Africa, and do visit our Facebook page. I'm Famida Miller. Thanks for watching. Global Biz is up next.